Posso ir, né, Cris? Ok. Buenas noches, good night, good afternoon, buenas tardes. Quiero agradecer muchísimo la presencia de todos que están con nosotros hoy en ese nuevo debate del Fórum de Discusiones Pendientes y Emergentes, que es una iniciativa conjunta, una iniciativa latinoamericana conjunta del Observatorio de Sexualidad y Política, que yo coordino, SPW, Acajata de Argentina, Promsex de Perú, Puentes y Sinergia. El debate de hoy es parte, como deben saber ustedes, por el anuncio que han recibido, la invitación, es parte de un ciclo de conversaciones que hemos dibujado para el año de 2024, que es el año del megaciclo electoral. Pues un año donde ya han pasado, van a venir, pero en total se contabilizan 69 elecciones presidenciales, varias elecciones locales que no están en los mapas y también una elección regional muy importante que es la elección para el Parlamento Europeo. Empezamos ese ciclo en el 7 de mayo con un debate sobre elecciones en América Latina. El video del debate ya está disponible en nuestro canal de YouTube de SPW. Y hoy tenemos el segundo debate de ese ciclo, que es sobre las elecciones en Estados Unidos, programadas para noviembre. Un poco accidentalmente, ocurrió que programamos la conversación de hoy, un poco sin tener la conciencia de eso, para una semana en que casualmente ocurren 4 de las elecciones más importantes de ese ciclo. Una de ellas fue la elección de Sudáfrica, muy importante para el continente africano, que se ha hecho el 30 de mayo, cuyos resultados han salido ayer. La segunda es la elección mexicana de ayer, donde hemos asistido a esa insólita escena de 2 mujeres candidatas a la presidencia de la República. El resultado de las elecciones de India salió hoy con sorpresas, porque el resultado no corresponde a lo que decían las encuestas o la propaganda del régimen de Modi. Y finalmente, al final de la semana, tendremos las elecciones para el Parlamento Europeo. Seguramente todas las elecciones de ese año son muy importantes, ¿no? Pero hay algunas que tienen un impacto regional y geopolítico mayor que las otras, ¿no? Y seguramente las 4 de esa semana tienen ambos efectos. Y la elección de que vamos a hablar hoy, sobre la cual vamos a intercambiar percepciones, visiones, interpretaciones, es una de las más potencialmente impactantes en el escenario regional latinoamericano y también en el escenario transnacional, que es la elección de Estados Unidos. Para traernos insights, ideas, interpretaciones, visiones, tenemos un excelente panel y quiero agradecer muchísimo la presencia de Anat, de Françoise, de Heidi, de Fernando en la sesión de hoy. Y voy a presentarlos muy rápidamente para no tomar tiempo después que empecemos la conversación. Anat Schenker Osorio es presentadora del podcast Words Went By y directora de ASO Comunicaciones. Ha dirigido investigaciones sobre temas muy variados como sindicalización, energía limpia, derechos de migrantes, reforma de la justicia penal. Su enfoque original, mediante experimentos y encuestas, ha contribuido a victorias electorales y políticas progresistas en muchos lugares del mundo. Ha presentado hallazgos en distintos foros muy importantes. Ha publicado artículos en el New York Times, The Atlantic, The Guardian, y escribió un libro que tiene un título maravilloso, que es No lo compres. El problema de decir tonterías sobre la economía. Es maravilloso, ¿no? Muy inspirador. Tenemos también con nosotros Françoise Girard, que es una amiga querida de muchos años, autora, defensora, experta en salud de la mujer, derechos humanos, sexualidad, HIV-Sida y movimiento feminista. Durante más de 20 años, Françoise ha colaborado con activistas feministas de todo el mundo para defender derechos de las mujeres y justicia de género. Su trabajo se centra en la autonomía corporal, la salud sexual y reproductiva, incluyendo los derechos al aborto. Los esfuerzos de Girard han influido en los marcos de las políticas globales de Naciones Unidas y anteriormente se desempeñó como presidenta de la International Women's Health Coalition durante 8 años. Tenemos también Heidi Berich, que es una experta en extremismo de derecha en Estados Unidos y Europa, incluyendo movimientos supremacistas blancos y antisemitas. En 2020 cofundó el proyecto global contra el odio y el extremismo, el GEPAE, que es una fuente que consultamos con mucha frecuencia en el observatorio. Berich ha testificado ante el Congreso norteamericano sobre extremismo y ha asesorado cómo combatir el discurso del odio y el terrorismo doméstico. Ha escrito numerosas publicaciones académicas y coeditado Neo-Confederacy, A Critical Introduction. Frecuentemente aparece en los principales medios de comunicación. Tiene un doctorado en ciencias políticas de la Universidad de Purdue y anteriormente dirigió el proyecto de inteligencia del Southern Poverty Law Center, que es una de las fuentes principales de información sobre el extremismo en Estados Unidos y fuera de Estados Unidos. Y tenemos también con nosotros Fernando Brancoli, que es un otro amigo querido, que es profesor asociado de Relaciones Internacionales, Defensa y Seguridad, Análisis de Riesgo Político en la Universidad Federal de Río. Imparte clases en el programa de MBA de la Fundación Getúlio Vargas y es fellow en el Instituto de Estudios Avanzados de Princeton. Ha sido fellow entre 21 y 23. Además, es investigador asociado en el Centro Orfalea de Estudios Globales de la Universidad de Santa Bárbara. Una cosa que Fernando nos ha informado en su biodata es que el año pasado publicó un libro en inglés sobre el bolsonarismo. Es un especialista en bolsonarismo. Y bueno, con esas presentaciones hechas, yo paso la palabra a Nat, que tendrá 15 minutos para traernos sus insights, ideas, reflexiones sobre esa contienda electoral tan relevante. Sonido.
Ajá, mira, ya fracasé, perdón. Hola, buenas tardes. Vengo aquí de California, entonces para mí todavía tarde, no noche. Muy agradecida de estar con ustedes. Voy a hablar en español, o sea, mejor dicho, espanglés, como dice mi hijo Diego, que es una palabra en español para Spanglish. Voy a hablar muy rápidamente en mis 15 minutos sobre lo que está pasando aquí en términos electorales en Estados Unidos y sobre todo no solamente qué es la temperatura, sino qué es nuestro plan para cambiar la temperatura en forma metafórica, no literal, ya que el cambio climático lo está haciendo. Para los que se han salvado de cómo funcionan las elecciones en Estados Unidos, yo podría pasar todo mi tiempo y mucho más tratando de explicar lo inexplicable del por qué aquí la mayoría no gana. Pero para poder poner en contexto el resto del discurso, solo quiero darles una lección súper breve de 30 segundos para que entiendan que en Estados Unidos, a pesar de que tenemos 50 estados y mi estado, California, es donde vive la mayoría de la gente, no contamos. Para la elección presidencial solamente hay entre 6, tal vez 7 estados. Podría ser que el estado de Carolina del Norte está en juego, pero la mayoría de las personas creemos que son 6 estados que cuentan. Son los estados que aquí están en este color, diría gris, beige, algo por el estilo. Eso es por nuestro sistema electoral. No voy a tardar mucho explicando todo eso, pero la razón por qué eso importa es porque la clave de entender nuestras elecciones es que nosotros ganamos o perdemos por entre 1 y 2% de los votantes en 6 lugares. Entonces, cuando ustedes ven constantemente todos estos artículos periódicos, la gente gritando sobre esa encuesta, esta encuesta, esta encuesta, mi mejor consejo es que no tomen nota de nada de eso, porque ahorita todavía la mayoría de los votantes no tienen ni idea lo que van a hacer. Número 1. Número 2, la mayoría de esas encuestas no son sobre estos 6 estados, sino muchas veces están presentando datos de todo el país que no tiene sentido y que no tiene por qué estar viendo eso. Número 3, la mayoría de esas encuestas, la diferencia entre los dos candidatos está entre los márgenes. Entonces, mi mejor consejo es por ahora ver un show de realidad o de cocina o de lo que sea que les guste. Hablando de encuestas, lo que sí es importante entender es que por una elección donde los dos candidatos no solamente vienen de partidos familiares, sino son los mismos candidatos que hemos tenido antes, lo cual en muchas formas hace de esa elección algo muy aburrido, para ser sincera, para la mayoría de nuestros votantes. Lo que nosotros estamos viendo es que en estos 6 estados claves, estados de batalla, como los llamamos, el 4 en 10 votantes no está comprometido. O sea, el 6 en 10 son ya voy a votar por Trump y así es y nada me va a cambiar. Voy a votar por Biden, nada me va a cambiar. Pero un número muy, muy grande todavía están decidiendo. Eso es algo muy diferente que en la mayoría de las elecciones. ¿Por qué? ¿Y quiénes son ellos? Ellos se pueden subdividir en grupos más pequeños y entre estos grupos, los dos que son más importantes para nosotros, los llamamos demócratas desafectadas. Son personas que en el pasado han votado, pero no regularmente. Y cuando votan, que es la clave, cuando, porque no es siempre, y no somos Brasil, no somos Australia, no tenemos que votar. Y la mayoría de las personas, una cosa muy importante entender de la política estadounidense es que el grupo más grande de votantes estadounidenses son personas elegibles que no votan. Este grupo es más grande que demócratas y más grande que republicanos. Entonces, este grupo que nosotros llamamos demócratas desafectados son más o menos el 8% de los votantes y recuerdan, ganamos o perdemos por 1 o 2%. El otro grupo donde tenemos esperanza son los votantes por persuadir que votan con más regularidad, pero cambian de partido. Nosotros enfocamos todo nuestro esfuerzo en estos dos grupos. ¿Qué sabemos de estos dos grupos? Una forma de entenderlos, nosotros los llamamos los doble odios. Odian a Trump y odian a Biden. Y a pesar de que solo tenemos dos partidos principales aquí y básicamente en Estados Unidos es imposible que gane alguien de otro partido, tenemos tres candidatos en esta elección y es algo que hay que entender. ¿Qué es el tercer candidato? Quedar en casa. Y este candidato siempre tiene la ventaja porque la gente ya está en casa. No solamente pueden no votar, lo que estamos viendo en este año es una decisión mucho más sofisticada y es la idea de votar para todo menos presidente. O sea, votar por Congreso, por Senado, por cosas, puestos locales, pero no escoger. Y esta es una cosa que entre 1 y 2% de las personas hicieron en el 2016. Entonces, es una amenaza real. Enfrentando esta amenaza y entendiendo exactamente qué está en juego, nosotros encontramos una narrativa de la derecha que es muy familiar, no solamente aquí en Estados Unidos, sino en todo el mundo. Y esa narrativa, como me imagino que la mayoría de ustedes ya conocen, se basa en crear miedos raciales, no solamente, también de género, pueden ser existenciales, no vienen de la forma correcta, nos están quitando los trabajos, el inmigrante mágico que te está quitando el puesto y también no está trabajando, ¿cómo funciona eso? Yo no sé. Las personas con su ideología de género que está cambiando nuestra cultura, nuestra forma de ser. Y estos miedos que conocemos súper bien del discurso de la derecha, el efecto que ellos tienen es crear enojo y furia y miedo contra el otro, y el otro puede tomar muchas formas, pero tenemos que entender que su propósito principal es crear una falta de fe en el mismo gobierno. Es quitarnos la idea de que que puede haber un nosotros. Puede haber, por ejemplo, seguro de salud universal. Pueden haber escuelas públicas buenas y educación universitaria gratis. Puede haber programas sociales que son para todos. Y la idea es que eso no puede existir porque siempre hay un ellos que no quiere trabajar, un ellos que no enseña bien a sus hijos, un ellos que nos quieren cambiar la cultura. Eso crea resentimiento económico y el ciclo sigue y sigue y sigue. ¿Cómo manifiesta esto? Voy a tocarles un anuncio real de la campaña de Trump. Esto es un anuncio que ellos pusieron en la radio en español para votantes latinos. Ellos todavía no han salido con muchos anuncios nuevos para este ciclo, entonces esto es el 2020, están reciclando los mismos. Lo que tienen que saber antes de escucharlo es que Goya es una compañía de comida enlatada, sobre todo mexicana. Venden frijoles, salsa, etcétera. Entonces, cuando refieren a Goya, a eso refieren.
Hola Carmen, ¿qué onda?
Oye, ¿viste que los demócratas quieren cerrar a Goya?
¿Qué? No manches, a mí ningún güero me quita mis tacos.
Y no solo es eso, Araceli, también están quemando iglesias y hasta la Virgencita.
¿Qué se creen estos demócratas?
Nos quieren aumentar los impuestos, la renta y ahora quitarle los fondos a la policía. Están loquísimos.
Pues yo vine a este país a trabajar. Y si estos demócratas me quieren cobrar tantas cosas, no me va a alcanzar.
Los demócratas están en otra onda y ahora es obvio que no respetan nuestra cultura.
Ni de broma vuelvo a votar por un demócrata.
Ni yo, y menos por el Joe Biden ese. Ese fue el que rompió su promesa con la inmigración, el cuate de las deportaciones.
Hijo, Biden, ese sí que no. Él es malísimo para nosotros. Oye, tengo que irme. Hablamos luego.
Sale, nos vemos.
Latinos for Trump.
Envía la palabra Goya.
Bueno, ¿cómo podemos enfrentar esa narrativa? Nosotros hemos estado trabajando ya años, básicamente desde que ganó Trump la primera vez en el 16, con esa narrativa que llamamos la narrativa de raza y clase, y tenemos una forma ya más nueva que llamamos la narrativa de raza, clase y género. Consiste en un énfasis en la solidaridad interracial y también entre género para crear un gobierno para todos, hecho de todos, que representa a todos y que logra prosperidad compartida, justicia racial y también justicia de género. Esa narrativa que hemos experimentado no solamente en Estados Unidos, sino en otras partes del mundo vez tras vez, tiene un orden muy específico. Comienza con un valor compartido y una insistencia que ese valor está compartido a través de raza, de género, de clase, de cualquier forma de división que la oposición está tratando o de crear o de ampliar. Número 2, segundo, llamamos a los villanos muy directamente. Hablamos de quienes están causando actualmente los problemas que enfrentamos y que el por qué el cuento de que el otro tiene la culpa no es correcto, porque es una forma de tratar de esconder lo que está haciendo un par de personas con mucho poder y mucho dinero para ocultar lo que quieren lograr, que es básicamente quitarnos nuestros derechos, nuestras libertades y controlar a la población, o por lo menos la mayoría. De allá enfatizamos la idea de unidad, acción colectiva para lograr la victoria y hablamos de una visión, algo positivo. Otra vez, siempre hay 3 candidatos y el tercero es quedar en casa. Si no damos a la gente para qué votar, simplemente no van a votar. No es suficiente solo estar en contra de algo. Nosotros trabajamos bajo una teoría de cambio muy específico en cuanto a cómo es que podemos hacer oír un mensaje, sabiendo que el mundo es muy complicado, hay mucho sonido llegando a los oídos de nuestros votantes. Entonces, nosotros buscamos un mensaje que no solamente la base está de acuerdo, sino que ellos están dispuestos a repetirlo. Porque si tu coro no quiere cantar, la congregación no va a escuchar la música. Obviamente no hay suficiente de la base, ni aquí ni en muchos lados. Entonces también tenemos que tener un mensaje que mueve al grupo que está por persuadir, que a veces votan así y a veces así. Tercero, entendemos que va a haber un grupo de personas que simple y sencillamente nunca van a estar de acuerdo con nosotros. Y con ese grupo tenemos que sentirnos cómodos de que estén odiando lo que estamos diciendo. Porque si a ellos les gusta lo que estamos diciendo, ¿qué es lo que estamos diciendo? O no estamos avanzando nada, estamos diciendo, ay, los niños son lindos, los cachorritos son preciosos, y eso está bien, pero no estás avanzando un argumento, o estás más bien repitiendo a la oposición, que es algo que los partidos del centro izquierda hacen mucho. En la elección anterior, nosotros nos enfocamos en un mensaje muy repetido, muy eficaz, que era protect our freedoms, proteger nuestras libertades. El concepto y la idea de libertad en Estados Unidos tiene un puesto de sumamente importancia. Cuando nosotros preguntamos a los votantes estadounidenses qué valor más asocian con nuestro país, es libertad. Y esto tiene el puesto más alto y el segundo ni está cerca. Y esto es cierto a través de diferentes grupos, diferentes razas, edades, lugares. Siempre esa idea de que Estados Unidos, nuestro valor compartido es libertad, es súper importante. La izquierda aquí en este país, desafortunadamente, ha dejado a la derecha por mucho tiempo decir que ellos están a favor de la libertad y más bien hemos tenido miedo reclamar ese valor. Pero lo que quiero recordarles es que la idea de la libertad ha sido integral a nuestras victorias a través de mucho tiempo, comenzando, por ejemplo, con Franklin Delano Roosevelt, que obviamente habló de las 4 libertades, era parte integral del movimiento para derechos civiles y era obviamente integral para el movimiento más reciente para la igualdad de matrimonio. Cuando hicimos este proyecto en el 22, en las elecciones anteriores, creamos anuncios, creamos mensajes, hicimos diferentes encuentros para que diferentes tipos de organizaciones y candidatos podían utilizar el mismo mensaje vez tras vez. Aquí ven abajo, por ejemplo, ella, Mary Peltola, que es de Alaska, y ella diciendo pescado, familia y libertad. ¿Por qué pescado? Porque Alaska. O sea, la idea del mensaje se puede adaptar a diferentes contextos. ¿A dónde vamos este año para terminar? Todavía este concepto de libertad, sobre todo por la cuestión de aborto y ahora la cuestión de tratamiento de fertilidad, anticonceptivos, tenemos que siempre recordar a la gente que esta elección lo que nos toca defender es nuestra libertad. Hemos agregado también el concepto de nuestras familias y nuestros futuros. Voy a explicar el por qué. Lo que hemos visto a través de muchos estudios, ahora vamos en esto por meses y meses y meses de diferentes tipos de experimentos, es que nuestra narrativa o nuestro trabajo consiste en 3 narrativas entrelazadas. Uno es interrumpir el sentido de desánimo que tiene la gente. Nosotros sabemos que el proyecto autoritario, sus últimos fines son hacer a la gente querer dejar de pelear. Porque mientras seguimos peleando, eso cuesta energía, cuesta dinero. Ellos tienen que esforzarse para ir en contra de nosotros. Entonces, comenzamos con este anuncio, que es un ejemplo sobre todo de enfrentar este sentimiento de desempoderamiento que tiene la gente y nuestros votantes, que los hacen querer ignorar todo lo que está pasando. Esto está en inglés, pero nuestros intérpretes lo van a interpretar.
In today's news,
Corporate price gouging.
new abortion ban.
Yes. Doom. That's all there is. Nothing can stop it. Doom!
We know things feel bleak right now. We can all feel
Helpless. Useless. I will suck them into despair.
But buck the up.
Wait! I need the powerless!
Come on. Ah,
Thanks.
we decide what comes next. We have made history before, and we will do it again. Let's do this.
Segunda cosa que tenemos que hacer, y estos no están en orden, hay que hacer cada uno y seguir y va el ciclo, es hacer el contraste. Lo que hemos visto a través de nuestros estudios es que es esencial en cualquier cuento, siempre hay un héroe y hay un villano. Ahora voy a enseñarles uno de los anuncios claves que utilizamos en la elección pasada y quiero que ustedes se fijan quién es el antagonista, y quién es el protagonista de este anuncio.
Which side are you on? Americans who believe liberty and justice are for all? Or traitors inciting violence against our country and trying to take away our freedoms? Which side are you on? People who work for a living and care for our families? Or the Trump Republicans who block everything our families need? This November, it's time to show which side you're on. Vote for Democrats. FFPAC is responsible for the content of this ad.
Creo bastante obvio que los republicanos en este entonces son los villanos de este anuncio, pero los protagonistas no son los demócratas y eso es clave. Protagonista eres tú, la persona viendo el anuncio, el votante, y es no solamente porque la gente no cree que los demócratas vienen para salvarnos, es muy difícil convencer a cualquier persona sobre eso, es porque lo que necesitamos de nuestros votantes es que ellos tomen acción. Entonces, tenemos que hacer a ellos los protagonistas de nuestros cuentos. Lo que vemos es que cuando cambiamos el enfoque de hablar de 2 diferentes candidatos, uno enfrentando al otro, lo cual causa una reacción de que no me gusta ni él ni él. No, mejor me quedo, mejor ignoro. A una discusión a 2 diferentes futuros, en eso podemos enganchar a más personas. Eso es un ejemplo. Oh, Eso no quiere... Algo pasó y no me quiere dejar tocar eso. Está bien, así ahorro tiempo. Eso es otro anuncio que muestra la diferencia entre hacer de la elección un cuento entre dos candidatos, una batalla entre dos candidatos, a una batalla entre dos diferentes futuros y hablar de que estamos en un desvío en el camino. No sé qué pasó. Qué raro. Algo que quiero señalar en cuanto a esto de cambiar el enfoque de dos diferentes candidatos a dos diferentes futuros, que es muy, muy importante poder hacer, es que cuando nosotros mostramos la agenda, los planes de los republicanos a los votantes, y cuando digo a los votantes, quiero decir incluso votantes republicanos, si no están realmente atados a Trump, odian la agenda. Cada punto en la agenda están en contra. El problema que tenemos es que la mayoría de la gente no se ha dado cuenta de los planes de ellos y cuando presentamos los planes de ellos, la mayoría de la gente está incrédula. Lo que ustedes pueden ver es que entre las muchas opciones que dimos en esta encuesta, preguntamos que sí o que no, si los republicanos ganan control de todo el gobierno en noviembre, van a implementar su agenda sí o no, y apenas el 20%, 21% de los votantes piensan que eso va a pasar. Vimos lo mismo con el aborto. Por una generación más, la gente decía, pero jamás lo van a hacer, pero jamás lo van a hacer. Es esta incredulidad que nosotros tenemos que enfrentar. No es que hay una atracción a la agenda de la oposición, es que hay una falta de creencia que realmente puede pasar. Y si hay preguntas sobre eso, estoy feliz de hablar de eso. Pero voy a terminar hablando de nuestro tercer paso narrativo, que es inspirar desafío. Cuando nosotros estamos hablando sobre diferentes emociones que podemos evocar en nuestros anuncios, en nuestros mensajes, nuestras narrativas, entre los sentimientos, las emociones negativas, está el miedo, lo cual entre gente progresista causa un deseo de ocultar, de esconder, de huir en la mayoría de las personas. En muy pocas personas, personas activistas, causa una reacción de querer pelear, pero eso es la minoría. En vez de crear miedo, tenemos que crear desafío, enojo, resistencia. Y voy a terminar mostrando una forma de hacer eso. Nosotros hemos visto que nuestra mayor oposición no es la oposición, a pesar de lo horrible que sean, es el cinicismo. No es que la gente no está de acuerdo con nuestras ideas, es que no creen que jamás pueden tener éxito. Entonces, ¿para qué involucrarme cuando eso es un mundo que nunca va a existir? Una forma de combatir eso en una narrativa es algo que llamamos en inglés we did, we can, we will. No traduce súper bien en español, pero lo hice, se pudo, se puede, se podrá. Es simple y sencillamente recordarles a las personas que hemos hecho cosas en el pasado, que hemos logrado avances. Si ustedes se fijaron en el primer anuncio que les mostré, no de Trump, pero el primero mío, hicimos esto. Habían unos anuncios sobre cosas que ganamos, por ejemplo, legalizar aborto en Ohio, etc. Esto es mi último ejemplo de este tipo de discurso, que lo hicimos, lo podemos hacer, lo haremos.
60 years ago, this seemed impossible. 15 years ago, this seemed impossible. 10 years ago, this seemed impossible. We decide what's possible. Be a voter.
Y con eso termino.
Muchas gracias, Anat. Quiero agradecerle muchísimo por varias cosas, pero para ser rápida, sobre todo por haber introducido el tema de la libertad, ¿no? Y la importancia de que los sectores progresistas hagan algo para que la libertad no siga secuestrada por las fuerzas de ultraderecha. Y estoy diciendo eso porque fue así, y la gente lo sabe, que terminamos nuestra conversación sobre las elecciones en América Latina. Es como si hay un hilo, ¿no? De la sesión de mayo para esa sesión que creo que es muy productivo. Y contigo la palabra, Françoise. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. I've been asked to speak today about the role of sexual politics in the upcoming elections. I'm a Canadian and American, and I live in New York City, so I have a certain perspective on all of this, and I've been working on abortion and women's rights, sexual and reproductive health and rights, both in the US and globally for 25 years. So I have some view of this. And what I'm going to say today, of course, comes with the caveat that no one has a crystal ball, given especially what Anat has said about the unreliability of polling at the moment in the US and the blatant use of polling for partisan purpose at this time. It's quite difficult to figure out based on polls what to make of all of this. And of course, I also want to make clear that I'm not going to suggest that sexuality and abortion are the only issues that are going to matter in November, especially for young people. We know that the situation in Gaza is a very mobilizing issue at the moment for young people, as well as environmental issues. And for everyone, of course, issues of immigration are very present in the news right now, as well as economic issues, gun violence, racism. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in the US at this time that can play out on both sides of the equation. But let's speak specifically about two issues in sexual and reproductive health and rights that I think are going to matter to some extent. One is abortion, and the other one is transgender rights. I think for abortion, and these are two issues that the right wing in the United States has invested a lot into, lots of money and energy into whipping up these issues and using them for their advantage. Abortion, certainly for the last 50 years, has been used by the right in the US to mobilize their base, and trans rights more recently in the last 10 years probably has been, when this issue has really come up. So let's speak first about abortion. I was interested what Anat had to say about, for people don't believe these things will happen, these bad things will happen. Well, with abortion, we believe it now. Yeah. Since Dobbs, the decision of the Supreme Court that overturned Roe v. Wade in June 2022, we've seen a dramatic and immediate impact in the lives of women and other pregnant people across the country, and it's only worsening. We have now 18 out of 50 states that have strict abortion bans, either de facto total bans or in practice total bans, forcing people to travel to access care if they cannot obtain abortion pills by mail, or if they're too far along in their pregnancy, which is more and more people because of the delays the restrictions on abortions are causing. The Guttmacher Institute estimated that last year in 2023, 160,000 pregnant persons were forced to travel out of state to obtain abortion care in the US. That's huge. That's a lot of people. At the moment, it's estimated that over 30% of American women live in states where they cannot access abortion. So that's, of course, causing delays and further and expense and anguish, as well as some forced births. We don't have good numbers yet, but there's an estimated numbers of thousands of forced births, women who didn't want to go through their pregnancies that have now been forced to do so. And at the same time as this is going on, we have a higher number of abortions than in previous years, because of course, all of this affects access to reproductive health care more broadly. When abortion clinics are forced to close in restrictive states, it's not just abortion services that go away, it's contraceptive services and counseling. And so as a result, we have also a higher number of abortions than in the last few years. So it's a very chaotic and troubling situation. The Republicans are continuing their attacks. So if we thought they'd be satisfied with what they've achieved so far, yes, I know not only women abort, and I've said pregnant people a few times. I want to make clear that I'm speaking about all people who have the potential to be pregnant. So we think that Republicans would maybe pause, stop with this, but they've continued their assault on abortion care. They've been described as the dog that has caught the car, is chasing the car and then catches the car and wonders what to do now. They're continuing their assault. The latest state to enact a ban was Florida at 6 weeks, which is basically making a large portion of the South an abortion ban zone. Louisiana has just voted to classify abortion pills as controlled substances, which means that from now on there could be drug trafficking charges laid on people who are found to distribute abortion pills. Women are now in danger of not being able to receive basic emergency care if they show up in an emergency room while pregnant. And several women in Texas nearly died when they were denied abortion care because they were not close enough to death to fit under the life of the mother or life of the woman exception in the Texas law. So it's a very catastrophic situation which continues to evolve and continues to get worse. There's also been in Alabama, the state Supreme Court deciding that fertilized embryos were persons. So this actually stopped in vitro fertilization in the state and has caused a significant backlash. And we have the Supreme Court of the United States, which 2 years after Dobbs is continuing to decide on abortion cases. They have 2 cases in front of them. One, which could restrict the provision of abortion pills at the national level, return restrictions on telemedicine for abortion care that were lifted during the COVID pandemic. And they're also deciding the question of whether pregnant persons are entitled to emergency care in emergency rooms to preserve their health, not just to save their lives, prevent their death, but actually just preserve their health proactively. So we're in a very dire situation. On elections, what we've seen so far as a result of this is a pretty clear impact on voter turnout. And that is important because of what Anat said, that we have a large group of people in the United States, half of voters, basically potential voters who don't vote every year. So having more turnout is very important, especially amongst people who are outraged by these measures because they're likely to vote Democrats. And we've seen especially an impact on the turnout of women and of young people. And that, of course, has been positive for the Democratic Party in the last couple of years. For example, in the 2022 midterms, Democrats kept the Senate when they were, it wasn't clear they were going to be able to hang on to it. And some of the polling showed they would lose the Senate, but they kept the Senate. It's a bare majority, but it makes all the difference. And the red wave, the Republican Party is considered the red state, even in the US system. The red wave didn't happen in the House of Representatives. And so the Republicans gained the House, but they have a very narrow margin, which doesn't give them a lot of room to maneuver. Since that midterm election in 2022, there have been several by-elections to fill seats in swing states, in swing districts, and in many of these cases, the Democrats have flipped the seats. And so they gained a seat that was held by a Republican before that. We believe because of the mobilization around abortion. I think it's fair to describe the mood amongst women of all ages and young people on this issue specifically as mobilized and enraged. There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of rage going. I can tell right now in talking to people and monitoring the conversation, the various websites and so on. And that has led to this defiance that Anat was pointing to, this sense that, we're not going to take this anymore. We're angry and we're going to take action. This is important because elections in the US are always close. This has been true for a long time. I mean, people think that US politics has become very divided recently, but it was always thus. I mean, if you look at the election of John F. Kennedy in 1959, it was very, very close. It's always been very, very close. So an increase in turnout, even of a couple of points, can have a significant impact one way or the other. There's other ways in which this question of abortion is playing out. One of them is at the state level on ballot initiatives, which are referenda that can be called either by the legislature or by a citizen initiative, where people collect signatures and then can force a referendum at the time of the election. And there's been several ballot initiatives since 2022 about whether abortion rights should be enshrined in the constitution of that particular state, because we're in a federal system where states also have their state constitutions. So we've lost abortion in the federal constitution, but it's still possible to enshrine it in state constitutions. And there's been several referenda on this in various states, as well as referendum that were trying to further restrict abortion in the state, sometimes by calling for fertilized embryos and fertilized eggs to be declared persons. And these ballot initiatives are important because they generally increase turnout also when it's an issue that people are mobilized about. And abortion, as I said, is mobilizing people. So ballot initiatives on abortion have really increased turnout. And with abortion, we've had an issue that's emerging really as decisive at the state level. And all the ballot initiatives since June 2022 have played out in favor of abortion, even in red states such as Montana, Kentucky, and Ohio. And this suggests that a number of Republicans, women most likely, are voting in favor of abortion rights on the ballot initiative, even if they continue to vote Republican on the rest of the ticket. But of course, this has also motivated progressive voters to come out and push for these measures. And for example, we had the interesting case in Vermont where abortion rights were not in danger, but Vermonters actually came up with a ballot initiative that not only enshrined abortion rights in the Constitution of Vermont, but actually did away with all the gestational limits in Vermont, so that now Vermont is one of those states where there's no gestational limit. And if you need an abortion after a viability, so-called viability of the fetus, you can go to Vermont. And that's something new that has happened in the last 2 years. Now, this is important because this November, we could have ballot initiatives in up to 15 states, both pro-abortion and anti-abortion, but either way, they're good for turnout, and I think good for Democrats. For example, we have ballot initiatives that have already been confirmed in Florida, in Colorado, in South Dakota, and in Maryland. And we have ballot initiatives that are almost guaranteed in Arizona and Missouri, 2 states where things are very much in play. There's a likely ballot initiative in Oklahoma that would enshrine fetal personhood in the state constitution and therefore endanger in vitro fertilization and obstetric care more generally. And that, no doubt, will generate a higher turnout in a place like Oklahoma on this issue. So that's one way it's playing out at the state level. The other way it's playing out is on election of judges. In a number of these states, the judges who voted against abortion rights are up for re-election because we have elected judges in a number of states in the US. And this will be an opportunity for voters to decide whether the judges that voted against abortion can keep their jobs or not. Because state level courts have played a very key role. Once the federal guarantee of abortion was disappeared, then it became the job of legislature and state level courts to decide the fate of abortion restrictions. So voters are paying attention to races for judges, electoral races for judges at the state level. I can think, for example, of the judges in Alabama that decided that fetuses were persons and therefore endangered in vitro fertilization in the entire state, or the very recent decision last week of the Texas Supreme Court in Zurowski versus Texas, which found that the medical emergency exception in the anti-abortion law in Texas was clear enough, and the women who almost died didn't have standing because they weren't pregnant anymore. That is a pretty outrageous decision, and I think that there will be some elements of rage that will propel women to come out and vote to get some of these judges tossed out. The same is true in Arizona. 2 of the judges that voted to revive the 1864 abortion law in Arizona, you heard about this, that they revived the 19th century law that was on the books even before Arizona was a state. 2 of those judges are up for re-election, and I frankly would not bet money on them. The same is true in Florida, where 2 of the judges who try to keep the ballot initiative off the ballot are also up for re-election. In total, we have 14 judges who voted to uphold abortion bans that are up for re-election this year, including in other places like Georgia, Michigan, and Ohio. And I think a number of them will be defeated because of their opposition to abortion. Now, this isn't going to change the bench, remake the courts, but it will send a message to some of these judges and it will drive turnout. There's also been an interesting impact on the Democratic Party itself of all of this. For the longest time, Democrats, to our frustration, were very hesitant and quiet and hedging their bets on abortion. It was true with the Obama administration. It was true with Hillary Clinton. You will remember her famous saying that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, right? Which of course made no sense in the country where there's about 800,000 abortions a year. It's not rare. And it's been true with Biden himself, Joe Biden himself, who was, for example, a constant and faithful supporter of the Hyde Amendment, which has banned federal funding for abortion since the mid-1970s. And until very recently, he kept invoking his Catholic faith to explain the reason why he wouldn't speak about abortion. So things are changing. The Democratic Party has realized that abortion is a winning issue, so they're finally being more proactive on reproductive rights, and that's a very important change for us, for all of us working on abortion rights. They figured out that they can expose Republicans on reproductive rights, and one of the ways they're doing this is by forcing votes on bills in Congress. Even if these bills don't pass or don't yet have a chance to pass, they make clear how extreme the Republican Party is. For example, Democrats have pushed repeatedly for the Women's Health Protection Act, which would codify Roe v. Wade into law. They recently put forward a bill to protect in vitro fertilization and another bill just this week to guarantee the right to contraception. And all of these bills have been blocked so far by Republicans. You see, the Republicans have caught the car and they can't stop themselves. So they've blocked they're blocking the bill on the right to contraception. So this makes for great campaign ads, the ads that Anat showed us, but it also it yields promises that the activists will demand that Democrats fulfill when they regain the Congress and keep the White House. So we now have a set of issues and set of bills that we can demand action on. And the Republicans are running scared. Even though they're continuing with this extreme agenda, they're in fact scared, especially, I would say, on in vitro fertilization, which 86% of Americans support. They have tried to muddy the water by presenting their own bill in Congress in support of IVF, but, and it's Matt Gaetz of Florida, of all people, who presented it. But when you examine the content of the bill, you realize that it doesn't address the question of discarded embryos, which is one of the key issues in this whole debate. So they're trying to claim that they're in support of IVF, but in fact, they don't want to clarify the question of whether embryos are persons or not persons, which is, of course, the whole issue and then the problem that arose as a result of the decision in Alabama. And in addition to trying to look like they're supportive, they're trying to hide their past positions on abortion. There was an interesting study done by Axios that looked at dozens of websites of Republican candidates, which they've scrubbed now of their anti-abortion positions. They've removed all mention of being anti-abortion. And some of them in swing states are even claiming that they were misunderstood in the past. Trump himself has tried to generate a little bit of confusion on his positions. He said, for example, that Arizona had gone too far when it revived the 19th century law and said, I'm sure they're going to fix it. And he's taken the position that abortion is up to the states as a way of suggesting that he's not going to support a national abortion ban, the same abortion ban that Republicans have been trying to pass for years now. Now, at the same time, he can't help he can't stop himself from bragging about having overturned Roe v. Wade. And he can't hide the fact that if he says it's up to the states, then de facto he agrees with all these very dire measures that I've just described earlier. Regarding the impact of all this on the movement for reproductive rights and abortion rights, I think we have a much more united movement for abortion rights in the US than before as a result of all of this. I guess there's nothing like adversity to clarify the stakes. Our language as a whole has become much more direct and much more bold. Many of the debates and the disagreements of the past have been shelved, at least for now. There's much less talk of choice and using euphemisms like abortion should be rare or it's always a difficult or controversial issue. This used to be often heard in progressive circles as a ways of explaining our positions on abortion. That's much less the case now. And people are saying things like, everyone knows someone who's had an abortion, everyone loves someone who's had an abortion. It's much more forward. And in fact, I think we are in fact falling in line in the movement increasingly with the voters that feel that there should be no state interference on abortion. That used to be a small proportion of voters. It's an increasing proportion of voters that increasingly voters feel the state has no business in the provision of abortion, should not be in the medical cabinet when a woman is or a pregnant person is deciding whether they want an abortion. And in fact, if you look at Democrats themselves, the people we need to get out, 85% of them say that abortion should be legal in all or most cases, 85% of Democrats. Now, moving on trans rights, which has been the other topic that the right wing has whipped up, we've seen this issue definitely being used to mobilize voters, and it's been particularly evident in places like Texas, Florida, and North Carolina in particular. And Republicans there have focused on trans children particularly. That's been the issue is, the whole question of children and transgender identity. They've done this in two ways, one of which has been about the health care that transgender kids should be entitled to. And they've been done this under the guise of protecting children, right? Protecting children from doctors and even, I guess, their parents, protecting them against people who will try to persuade them to transition. But also at the same time, very perversely, Republicans are portraying those very same trans kids as dangers and as threats to other children, and particularly to girls, for example, in school bathrooms or in school locker rooms or in school sports competitions. And this, to some extent, has worked because, and has caused concern amongst parents and ordinary people, because most people are not particularly well informed on this issue. And that's not surprising. I mean, it's an issue that is quite complex. Most people don't have a good grasp on it. The attacks have had, of course, tremendous impact on trans kids and families of trans kids, and they've been very, very damaging. They've affected gender-affirming care pretty dramatically in some cases. Some states have moved to ban puberty blockers and hormonal treatment, even with the support of parents. And they've forced, in some cases, young people and their families, as well as some doctors, to move out of state in order to be able to continue to receive care. Now, how is this playing out electorally? I'm not seeing the same impact on the November elections when it comes to trans rights. It doesn't seem as potent as an issue as abortion is. Of course, for starters, it doesn't affect as many people. I mean, there's only 1% of children and people who are consider themselves trans. So making this a major part of any political platform, in fact, seems to strike people as strange and excessive. And it's actually playing out against Republicans as something a little bit extreme and bizarre. What is interesting, so it's, and on our side, if you want to say on the progressive side, it's not mobilizing people to come out. We don't have a unified progressive movement on this, the same way we have on abortion, and we're not seeing it mobilizing progressive voters in the same way. People won't come out on this issue the same way they are on abortion. There's also been, of course, confusion on our side caused by these so-called trans exclusionary radical feminists, which have confused some people in feminist circles about whether or not we should stand with trans folks. And there's open conflict on this amongst some elements in the feminist movement. But in general, I don't see the issue mobilizing progressives the same way. What is interesting, on the other hand, is that in the US at least, it also seems not to be a very powerful issue for far-right voters in general elections. It's been potent in primaries, where a candidate chooses who's going to represent them. And there it has led Republicans often to choose someone who is the most anti-trans candidate they can find. But when it reverts back to general elections, it seems not to play out in favor of Republicans. And I can give you an example. It has even backfired on some far-right candidates. For example, in Kentucky, the Republican candidate for governor, a man called Daniel Cameron, in 2023 repeatedly attacked transgender rights as one of his signature issues. And that didn't help him at all. And he lost to Andrew Beshear, the Democrat. And we're talking about Kentucky, which is a pretty conservative state. Beshear, you have to know, was already the governor, and he vetoed a law banning transgender care. And the legislature in Kentucky overrode his veto. So he had been attacked repeatedly by Cameron during the campaign as protecting trans surgeries for children, which is not what he was doing, but that's how it was presented. And he counteracted by putting out an ad that said, all children are children of God. And so stop these attacks. And the argument for the basic humanity of trans kids seemed to have won the day in a place like Kentucky. Even if people still have questions about specific matters, like whether trans girls should compete in school sports, it seems not to have generated the same level of support, even amongst right-wing voters. And polling is not showing that campaigning to restrict the rights of trans kids is a winning strategy. The same happened in Kansas last year, where it had seemed to work. In Virginia in 2022 with Governor Youngkin, it ended up backfiring on him the same way. That a year later, a trans woman, Danica Rome, was elected to the state Senate in clear repudiation of Governor Youngkin's agenda. So there seems to be much less room to work with this on the right-wing side. And if you look at an official like Governor DeSantis in Florida, who has attacked trans rights quite harshly, I noticed that he's diversified his portfolio, so to speak. He's invested a lot in other cultural war issues, of course, abortion, but also CRT, critical race theory, banning discussion of racism in schools, fighting DEI in state universities, and fighting immigration. The same has been true of Governor Abbott in Texas, who has attacked transgender rights, but has done much more, like expanded his portfolio, because I think they've realized that attacking trans rights alone is not decisive.
Francois, time, please. Time.
Happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Francois. Thank you so much. I would like to point out 3 things that you have said that I think very insightful for discussion or converge with what we see elsewhere. The first one is the importance to look not just the big picture of the presidential elections, but also to look into lower levels of politics and dynamics and resistance taking place at state level, municipal level, the judiciary. We usually gloss over that dimension that I think is very important for resistance in particular. The second thing is the resistance of progressive sectors in relation to matters of sexual politics. You're speaking about the US, but I guess this applies all over, more or less all over the continent. And I think it's a huge topic to be discussed. And finally, to have raised the critical question of trans-exclusionary feminists and the fractures and confusions they are creating within the progressive, across the progressive camp, but in particular within feminism, about trans issues with repercussions that go much further than just the question of trans rights. Yeah. So thank you very much. It's food for thought. Heidi, with you.
All right. Thank you, Sonia. Let me put my presentation up. And thank you very much for having me. So I'm going to talk about the sort of conservative opposition and their agenda. And I will say that Francois, in many ways, has laid out in certain states like Oklahoma and Texas and others what that agenda looks like. And it's already being enacted in many states on a range of issues. I'm going to talk about something called Project 2025, which is a coalition of 100 conservative organizations that have laid out the vision of the United States that they want to see. This is a very much Christian nationalist infused agenda. It's anti-women's rights, anti-LGBTQ, and it's important. I mean, they say Project 2025 is for the next quote unquote conservative president, but really this is the agenda that's going to be leading the far right for a long time into the future. Whether they win this election coming up, they lose, it'll be enacted at the state level and so on. So it's really important for people to understand this. Also, in reference to some of the things Anat said and Francois said, this is an agenda that is quite frightening and not necessarily accepted by voters in the movable middle. So understanding this agenda is really important in terms of how to motivate voters to vote against extremism in the US. So Project 2025 is spearheaded by an organization called the Heritage Foundation, which has become incredibly radical in recent years since Trump left office, and a lot of Trump people went to the Heritage Foundation. They have assembled 100 far-right groups to push Project 2025. You can actually, there's a website, project2025.com. You can read all about this. And in essence, they've shown their hand in a way that has not been the case in the past. In other words, they've written down exactly what the far right wants to do. And it's an anti-LGBTQ, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-people of color, anti-women's rights agenda, and also deals with climate change and election denial and so on. I already mentioned that this is a Christian nationalist agenda. The entire plan privileges a particular version of Christianity, very far right evangelical Christianity, over other religions, and ultimately would obliterate what the US has, which is the separation of church and state. They use the term religious freedom, which I think is interesting given Anat's discussion of freedom as a term, as the cudgel, right, as the argument that we need religious freedom, which really means privileging one kind of religion over others, and also over communities that they see as impinging on that religious belief system, in particular the LGBTQ community. Now, this 100+ group of organizations is filled with very extreme outfits. America First Legal is Stephen Miller's organization, which has been suing lately, claiming that there's all kinds of anti-white racism out there and having some success. He's also the architect of the punishing immigration policies under the Trump administration, and he's friends with white supremacists. The Center for Immigration Studies, I'm just going to mention a couple of these. When I was working at the Southern Poverty Law Center, we listed them as an anti-immigrant hate group for their ties to white nationalists, their leaders' horrible statements about immigrants. And then we have Alliance Defending Freedom, which is probably the most powerful anti-LGBTQ organization in the country, behind the Dobbs decision in the US, the mifepristone case that's coming that Francoise mentioned, and some other groups that are rabidly anti-LGBTQ. This is just a sample. You look through the list of these groups, it's more and more of that. What's important about this, and the reason why I say the agenda won't end depending on the elections, is these groups have lots of money. And when I say lots of money, I mean billions of dollars. Heritage Foundation itself in its last tax return had upwards of $325 million. Leonard Leo, who orchestrated our current Supreme Court appointees, got a donation of $1.6 billion from one person. So even if this agenda is rejected in the elections coming up or in other times, they will be back and they will be back and they will be back. So what does Project 2025 say? No more diversity, equity, and inclusion. Nothing related to affirmative action or efforts of racial equity. It rages against anything quote unquote woke, which is a very popular thing among the DeSantises of the world, critical race theory, and it would strip all equity efforts out of all of the administration. So what this plan is for a president to transform the next administration and all its agencies, places where he would be able to take action without oversight from Congress necessarily, and by executive order. In other words, there are things the president has control over that doesn't have oversight. So they would strip all these kinds of efforts out. The project takes particular aim at the LGBTQ community. HHS would no longer deal with this. All language related to the community would be removed. They want to reverse recent decisions that have extended some worker protections and other things to this particular community. It would be devastating for the LGBTQ community. Women's rights, of course, would be obliterated. Abortion, nationally banned. If they were able to pull that off, that would take legislation. Anything that the federal government does to help sexual health and reproductive rights, including things like contraception, gone. I should have mentioned on the LGBTQ community too, it's very likely that they would go after same-sex marriage. Samuel Alito, one of our justices, has already talked about this. There is precedent in this document for saying that that was a right that should not have been given. In other words, it's just stripping rights is what I should say. People of color would be profoundly affected because poverty programs and all kinds of other things would no longer be allowed. And the immigration policies in Project 2025 make the past Trump administration look like it wasn't doing anything on immigration. I mean, the border would be militarized. They are going to establish tent camps across the country, round up children, separate families. The list of horrors goes on and on. It would be the most devastating immigration policy the US has ever seen. So you see Trump and allies plotting militarized deportations and detention camps. There also, within this plan, is an aspect in which the entire federal government would be weaponized against the opponents of these folks. They've spoken openly about politicizing the Justice Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation and using it to go after people who would not agree with whoever the president might be. They've also talked about deploying the military on Inauguration Day to put down any kinds of protests and using the military against protest movements. This is very scary because we've already seen Republicans in Congress open investigations into agencies that are doing work on LGBTQ rights, like at the Department of State. There's like 50 investigations there. The House Oversight Committee has gone after nonprofit organizations that do work on online hate. Republican attorneys general are doing the same against an organization called Media Matters. So this has already kind of started. The other thing they want to do is stop the United States from having an apolitical civil service. They want to fire thousands of employees. Kevin Roberts, the head of the Heritage Foundation, has said this openly to the New York Times, and replace them with their political appointees. And they've been preparing these people aggressively, training them through a series of courses to be able to stack the administration with their people. And then there are other things that would be devastating. Climate policy, for example, would be out the window. They want to shut down the National Oceanic NOAA and Atmospheric Administration. You know, they don't want to even tell us what the data is in science related to these kinds of things. They want to abolish the endangered species list, you know, and it goes on and on like this. So that's the domestic impact. This also has, Project 2025 has a massive international aspect to it. In other words, foreign policy would radically change in the United States if the next president were to adopt these things. And I should say that Trump's own plans on his website are very, very similar to everything on Project 2025. So the next administration would essentially start to abandon the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in favor of the Geneva Consensus, right? The anti-abortion, anti-LGBT declaration that was started by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo under Trump and now has a few signatories. Of course, it doesn't have any, standing in international law, but that's what the United States would move towards. The Department of State would look at all the different international agencies that the U.S. is involved in and basically make a decision about which ones to be in and not be in. This is directly from Project 2025's booklet, which is 900 pages long. It would all be about any organization involved in allowing, any supporting abortion, supporting LGBTQ rights. All these things would be reasons for the Trump administration to abandon various institutions. And as I mentioned, the Geneva Consensus and the idea of the family as the basic unit of human society, that would become the reading, and the entire policy basically of the State Department would be anti-abortion, anti-women rights, and anti-LGBTQ rights, and a big shrinking and leaving from the international system. So they advocate leaving the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the OECD. They would want to change the US's relationship with NATO, with the United Nations fundamentally, even possibly leave, and with the World Health Organization. So the United States would function in a very different way from what we have today. The other thing that they talk about openly is that they would remove any kind of effort. This is their language, focus on core diplomatic activities and not the American culture wars. But what this is really talking about is the United States would no longer protect LGBTQ rights or attempt to expand them in Africa. So this means that the Ugandans of the world would be able to continue to practice these punishing policies unobstructed. USAID, I have this in here, would be so completely radically changed as to be unrecognizable. So Project 2025 believes the agency needs to be de-radicalized. It needs to stop its DEI efforts and the quote-unquote bullying LGBTQ plus agenda. They would get rid of whole sections of USAID and create sort of a pro-life gender coordinator. Be no more gender advisors, references to gender, gender equality, gender diverse, etc. All of that and everything related to sexual and reproductive health rights would be gone. And in their words, this would be ending the promotion of gender radicalism and the global abortion industry. And just a last thing I want to say about this, about Project 2025, it's a key piece in the far right's efforts to build a different international system. Much of what Project 2025 talks about is lifted out of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's playbook. And especially when it comes to, anti-LGBTQ, anti-women's rights, anti-immigrant, obviously with Orban, Christian nationalism with Orban openly talks about. But it's not just the Orban regime. There are a lot of governments that are lining up behind this vision, and they meet at organizations like CPAC, these international conferences, Political Network for Values, and they represent, if they are successful in, taking over enough governments and sort of warping the way politics works, they would be radically changing the post-war system and the agenda of human rights. So I think these are things that we have to take seriously, because even if this doesn't happen, this in the coming months in the United States, we don't know if the Bolsonaristas, I'm saying that right, will rise back to power. We don't know if, the big victory in Poland over the PIS party could be changed. In other words, we have to be constantly concerned about this agenda and what it represents for human rights, for democracy, and, for a lot of our lives. So with that, I will stop.
Thank you so much, Heidi. This was very strong. I think you provided us with the potential nightmare. I think it's very interesting for us and I think inspiring to discuss the views brought by Anat and you in terms of how this play out together, most principally in terms of how the voters in the US itself see this agenda that has been being deployed by Heritage Foundation and its partners. But I also do think that it's very important that you remind us that even if Trump is not elected, this agenda is not going to go away, because of the amount of resources they have and power they have, but also because of the international connections that are already established and that will keep filtering those ideas and those objectives in a transnational way. And with that, I give the floor to Fernando.
Thank you, Sonia. Good evening, everyone from Brazil. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, I was thinking that half of the most interesting stuff I've done in the last year, Sonia was involved, so it's great to be around such an interesting group. I know we're already here for an hour and a half, and some of the topics I was going to address, some of the colleagues already point out, so I'll try to emphasize some of the elements. So I will divide my presentation in two major topics. The first one is how the international is actually influencing the election in the US and what we should be looking into regarding conflicts and movements, political movements that somehow could push the elections to one way or another. And a second element that I think would be more interesting for us in the global south is what happens if in the end of the year we have another Trump administration, especially for us here in Brazil, in Argentina, and colleagues in Africa, and so on and so forth. So I will try to balance those two elements, and we are quite lucky in a sort of academic way because we already had 4 years of Trump. So somehow, I think Heidi already mentioned this, we can somehow predict some of his movements and what he's going to do, especially supporting other groups around the globe. So first of all, it's quite interesting. I was talking to my students here at the University of Rio de Janeiro because we'll have elections in Brazil too in the end of this year, but for mayors, basically. And for us, there's a clear distinction between national politics and international politics in Brazil. So you can clearly see what is national and what is abroad. And I would like to highlight how in the US, this distinction is not usually quite clear. I mean, what is national, what is international politics is usually quite blurred in the sense that candidates, politicians, and even the press can discuss this kind of things in a more integrated way. So I'd like to highlight some crises, I would say, that they do have some influence in the following election, and somehow we should take into account this kind of elements. The first one, of course, is the massacre in Gaza, and how it's actually including a lot of discussions right now in the US. It's basically because if you look to the numbers of polls and things like that, there's deep polarization between the US electorate regarding what the administration, the Biden administration, should be doing in Israel. I know most of you has already been following this, but the US, Washington in general, has been the biggest support for Netanyahu to implement the crisis and to create havoc in Gaza these days. I mean, if you look to who is paying for the ammunition and where the ammunition is coming from, is basically from the US, and also supporting in different avenues such as the United Nations. And in the last month, since the Hamas attack in October and the following attack by Israel, you can see a lot of divisions actually being addressed in the US right now, especially among young Democrats. I think some of my colleagues already pointed this out. The election in the US is not mandatory for people to actually go there. So for us in the global south, especially in Brazil, for us it's like mandatory. You'll not be able to get your passport if you're not to go to vote. And it's on Sunday. And in the US, it's during the week. So a lot of people actually must be convinced that they should go out to vote. And then you already have a problem because if you look to the polls, Biden has not been able to actually make people excited to go out to vote for him, to be a volunteer, to campaign for him. And this has many different explanations we can talk later. But if you look specifically for Gaza, if you look to the younglings at the Democrat Party, most of them has been saying that the support for Israel has been an element that can actually make them avoid actually go out for vote. This is, of course, especially into young Arabic voters. I've been to the US a couple of weeks ago. I was quite surprised by progressive friends saying, well, I'm not going out to vote. So it's not they're going to vote for Trump, but this actually created a scenario, such a bizarre scenario among the genocide in Gaza and the way that Biden has been addressing this, that people, if you look to the polls, and this is also quite interesting in the US, you actually have polls being done almost every week, so you can see the mood of the people going one way or another. A lot of the most young voters, they are actually saying that they are not really excited to vote and they can stay at home. And this, of course, can create a lot of trouble for Biden, especially if you look to the first election that he won against Trump, that was such a small margin, and he needs those young votes. And again, like we mentioned first, when you look to the election in the US, it's not like a popular vote. You can actually get the most votes and not get the job in the end of the day. So if we look to some of the states that we call the swing states, and they're not usually Democrats or Republicans, depending on each election, they are going to go for one way or another, such as Michigan. This can create a lot of trouble for Biden in the sense that they do have a huge Arabic community, and they already made some clear statements that they are not happy on this kind of things. So in this sense, you can clearly see on the press, on social media, and talking to people involved into politics, how the Gaza massacre and the conflict now in the Middle East can actually change the way people are going to vote, change their behavior on voting, and this can represent, in the end of the day, a lot of bizarre discussions regarding this. I think the second element is that we can emphasize international crisis that somehow is going to push different elements in the US is the Ukraine war. I mean, there is a huge discussion right now in the US if Biden should keep the support to Kiev, somehow if they should debate with Putin. And this has been addressed in the US right now, especially among, I would say, people in more independent, leading to Republicans or to Trump, in the sense that Biden is spending too much money in a war that's not really connected to the US, that's too far away, that this money could be better used on domestic issues. Last week, Trump was making public statements that he will end the war in 2 weeks, talking to Putin and all this kind of bizarre stuff he usually say. But somehow he's making connections that Biden made a political decision to support Kiev. And right now, this money should be better addressed to fight inflation and things like that back home. So this has been also quite useful for Trump and other Republicans to portray Biden as a sort of not really good politician, has been played out by different leaders abroad. And somehow this is also connected, as you probably heard, that Biden has been accused of not being in his best mental facilities. And there's a lot of bizarre arguments that he's too old to run, although he and Trump, they're actually quite similar age. But somehow this has been portrayed in this kind of sense. So right now, although the election in political science, we say it's usually about economics, it's usually how people are perceiving economics. These elements can also be used as symbolic questions or issues that can push some of the electorate. And I mean, we can mention Mexico, like Sonia just said, there's a lot of discussions regarding migration. Right now, Biden just announced it, actually a couple of hours ago, that it's going to change some of the politics regarding migration to the US, trying somehow to convince the people who are leaning to Trump but not truly convinced they should go to Trump, that maybe they can push over for Biden. So my argument here is that we should look into the international as a platform where symbolic elements can be used by politicians in the US to address these and other elements. So a lot of crises are quite operant in this moment. But what I would like to highlight in the second part is what can happen to other places if we have a Trump term, a new Trump term. And I mean, we're not talking about something that we don't know if could happen, because if we look to the numbers at the polls right now, actually Trump is the favorite right now to get the election. So although we still have some time to the end of the year, but if you look to every single poll, he's going quite well. So we actually will need, and Sonia has been, I think, one of the most important people in the global south regarding this, is we should prepare if in Argentina we get a far-right leader, and we actually did, and if in the future we got a far-right, more conservative leader in the US, what we can expect. And again, this is quite useful because we already had 4 years of Trump, and those 4 years, they did have a huge impact in global South politics and in I would say, wannabe authoritarian leaders in the global South, in Latin America and Africa and other places. And I'd like to highlight two elements that I think we as progressive activists or people looking to academia, to this kind of things, we should be prepared. The first one is symbolic. When the most powerful country in the world elect a far-right authoritarian leader, there is a huge impact across the globe. I remember my colleagues here that Jair Bolsonaro, Brazil former far-right president, liked it to be called the tropical Trump. And he was making comments all the time on how he was somehow at the same level as Trump, and he was replicating a lot of the platforms and policies that Trump was trying to push over. So if you look to Hungary, Orban, if you look to Marine Le Pen in France, if you look to Indonesia, to Egypt, to Argentina, and to Brazil, to a lot of different places around the globe, they look to the US as a sort of symbolic element where you can somehow get support. It's quite easy, and Trump has been quite vocal on this, to actually record a 10 seconds video supporting one of those leaders. So Bolsonaro was playing all the time a video where Trump was saying, or some of Trump's sons, that Bolsonaro was the chosen one and things like that. And these elements, they do have a huge impact on the ground. I mean, regarding voters in the global south, that somehow, and speaking as a Brazilian, a lot of people down here they still look to the US as a sort of paradise or sort of paradigm where we should be into. So the symbolic element is quite important, and I would like to highlight these kind of things, especially because Trump, again, during these 4 years in the first term, he was quite vocal to support far-right leaders across the globe. He was not shy in this kind of sense. Some colleagues like to say that Trump was an isolationist because he was not waging wars across the globe, but he was actually quite happy to push over different politics around the globe with those such as Bolsonaro, Duterte, and now with Milei in Argentina, how he was using a Trump discourse somehow to make amendments regarding these kind of things. And the second element that is also quite important is that Trump was actually quite happy to engage politically with authoritarian groups across the globe. If you look to Bolsonaro, and now if you look to Milei, he has been making promises, and in the case of Bolsonaro, he actually did it. He changed a lot of US policies to make a better word for Bolsonaro and all those kind of groups. So Trump into power, he can actually push over policies that are going to make a better life for authoritarians around the globe. And I mean, Heidi was mentioning the Geneva Consensus that right now Brazil was the leader for a while. And somehow this creates a sort of subjective platform, a transnational platform, where far-right groups across the globe are actually engaging to learn new strategies, to learn how to better engage with the public, with social media, and things like that. There is a great article on foreign policy a couple of months ago showing how important Biden was to Brazil democracy in the last months, actually. I know we all have a lot of critics towards Biden these days, and some of our friends here already know last year we tried to mimic the Capitol invasion back here in Brazil. So a couple of far-right protesters actually invaded the Supreme Court, invaded Congress, and actually destroyed all these areas. And what they were trying to do was to create havoc in Brasilia, to make Lula, who was like 8 years into power, to ask for the military to step in, to play a role as a security umbrella to push those people out. So it was not only chaos, they were actually quite smart to engage in what we call the law of guarantee of order, is when the president say, listen, the police is not working anymore, we need to call the army. So as you probably know, the army was quite close to Bolsonaro, and we were quite close to actually Lula decide to invoke the military to play the police role in this sense. And this foreign policy article by Oliver Stanco, a colleague here back in Brazil, he actually interviewed a lot of military back home. And what they say is, well, we were actually thinking about this, but we start to receive a lot of message from the US that if we try anything tricky, they will be in bad terms with them. So actually Biden was quite vocal, and the US ambassador in Brazil was saying that if the military actually tries something, then Washington could step in, not, I would say, invading Brazil, of course, but somehow blocking Brazil and making a lot of criticism. Again, if Trump was into power, I'm not sure that I could say that the tropical capital invasion back home was not successful. So we were actually quite close for a coup back in Brazil. And we'll have to take this into account, that if Trump wins, we'll have 2 years of Lula and Trump on the same term, and somehow we'll have to decide and discuss what we're going to do. And if a new Trump term somehow is going to galvanize far-right groups in the global south, my short answer is yes, a lot, not only with money, with symbolic elements, with the share of strategies and things like that. So I think it can be quite useful. And again, I praise Sonia for this, to look to the US election not only as a national issue and not only as an international discussion, but a transnational, a constellation of actors who are actually dealing with this, from sexuality, from subjectivities of global far right to violence, the role of military. Will have to play a role on. We'll have to take into account these kind of things. So again, I'm quite happy to be discussing this with you, especially because I have colleagues here, specialists on gender, on the military and violence, and somehow this is all connected. And if those far-right groups, they already understood that they can get quite galvanized by transnational connections, I would say us as progressive somehow will have to address this as a transnational issue as well. So this kind of platforms will have to keep doing in the sense that, well, probably we'll have to face new authoritarian groups in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fernando. Gracias. Estamos más allá del tiempo, pero hemos negociado con las intérpretes, así que tenemos un rato para tener algunas preguntas, ¿no? Yo entiendo que algunas preguntas se han hecho en el chat y que las personas han respondido, ¿no? Pero no todas, ¿no? Una pregunta, y quizás alguna de las preguntas sería bueno que fueran dichas no solo en el chat, pero para el público en general, porque cuando eso vaya a YouTube, sería bueno que las personas escuchasen, ¿no? Una de ellas fue para Anat, ¿no? Y que apareció algunas veces, que es sobre cómo ves la respuesta o la adhesión de los sectores persuadibles o mismo de los sectores republicanos frente a esas proposiciones tan radicales de la ultraderecha norteamericana, como han sido presentadas por Heidi en su presentación del proyecto 2025. Creo que esa es una pregunta bastante significativa. O sea, ¿qué efecto tiene eso o no? No, tanto en el campo republicano, como François decía, que en el caso de cuestiones trans, los efectos pueden no ser tan buenos como puede parecer en la retórica, ¿no? Pero sobre todo ese middle ground, la gente del tercer partido que no quiere salir de casa, ¿no? Como si eso tiene o no un efecto, ¿no? Un efecto.
Sí.
Entonces, yo creo que esa es una pregunta fuerte y dejaría después, si hay otras personas que quieren hacer más preguntas, que por favor pongan en el chat, porque Nana va a coleccionar las preguntas, ¿no? Ok, contigo, Ana.
Bueno, una pregunta un poco complicada, pero quiero separarla. Número uno, hay lo que tenemos que hacer a largo plazo, que es tratar de crear una sociedad donde no estamos atacando al otro construido del día, porque eso es un sistema horrible y sumamente inestable. Pero mi trabajo ahorita como una persona con un puesto en diferentes estados de batalla es ganar esa elección. Y ustedes que hablaron de que no vamos a ganar la elección, vamos a borrar esta parte de la grabación porque se crea la realidad hablando y vamos a ganar la elección. Simple y sencillamente no podemos creer de otro y tenemos que ganar, entonces es lo que vamos a hacer. De hoy a noviembre, y ojalá que fuera noviembre, es enero, porque tenemos un sistema de siglos pasados y no es que solamente ganamos, de allá también tenemos que tener la inauguración, que es todo un proceso. Nosotros tenemos que enfocarnos en hacer votar a nuestros votantes y persuadir los que están indecisos. Este grupo indeciso es chiquitino. Nosotros tendemos a enfocarnos en estos tal swing voters porque nos interesan mucho, a los medios de comunicación son muy interesantes, siempre están escribiendo sobre ellos, están comiendo en restaurantes en Michigan o Wisconsin y siempre se publican muchos artículos sobre ellos. Casi no hay nadie en este grupo. A mí me gusta bromear que ellos tuvieron todos que renunciar a sus trabajos porque todos tienen que estar tiempo completo en nuestros grupos de enfoque, porque ahorita hay como 9 personas indecisas. Esta decisión entre Trump y Biden, ya los votantes lo han tomado, si no son súper jóvenes. Entonces, la mayoría de las personas están decidiendo entre el sofá y Biden, no Biden y Trump. Entonces, tenemos que enfocarnos en este grupo indeciso para movilizarlos. Entonces, en cuanto a la elección, todas las cosas que yo dije durante mi discurso, ellos aplican, que tenemos que cambiar el tema de la elección, que cuando la gente queda pensando, esa elección es sobre la economía, como dijo Fernando, o esa elección es sobre el trabajo de Biden y si me gusta o no me gusta, estamos fregados, jodidos, para usar el término técnico. Pero cuando la gente está pensando, esa es una elección sobre si voy a tener más libertad o menos, sobre si voy a tener derechos o menos, o si mis hijos van a poder ir a la escuela a aprender sobre el pasado, si mi hijo trans, mi hija trans va a tener la libertad de ser quien es, entonces ellos van a tomar la decisión correcta. ¿Cómo sé? Yo sé porque entre el 2016 y ahorita, MAGA, esos republicanos de MAGA, ellos han perdido, hemos tenido 27 elecciones y ellos hemos ganado 23 veces. Ellos han perdido 23 de 27 elecciones desde el 16. Yo prefiero ganar elecciones que encuestas, entonces con esto me conformo. En cuanto a la pregunta más amplia, ¿cómo hacemos con estas personas indecisas o ellos hemos nos han contado un cuento falso sobre esa gente, no solamente en Estados Unidos, sino en todo el mundo, que los estudios no comparten, que no prueban. Nos dicen que son moderados, que son centristas, que quieren algo en medio. No hay nada en medio entre inmigrantes tienen derechos y son seres humanos y debemos separarlos y ponerlos en jaulas. Esto es blanco y negro, no hay en medio de estas dos cosas. Estas personas yo los llamo gente de buen punto porque son así. Buen punto, pero también buen punto, pero también buen punto. O sea, cambian de opinión según lo que está en su entorno y lo que escuchan repetido vez tras vez tras vez. Cuando ven a las personas en su ambiente con esa gorrita roja odiosa, ellos piensan, bueno, gente como yo así piensa, gente como yo apoya esto. Y esta cosa que llamamos en términos psicológicos social proof, prueba social, es una de las cosas más fuertes. Entonces, la forma que hemos visto para batallar esa cosa, y eso incluye estos nuevos discursos anti-trans, que son súper importantes, es narrar nuestros valores compartidos sobre la libertad, sobre el deseo, sobre el hecho de que cada hijo es un hijo de Dios, como dijo François, y hacer claro que la oposición de la derecha lo que están haciendo, simple y sencillamente, vez tras vez, es tratando de dividirnos, tratando de crear miedo, tratando de crear enemistad contra cualquier grupo que es el otro, para que estemos señalando en la dirección equivocada, para que estemos peleando entre sí y así ellos nos pueden robar. Con una mano señalan, con otra mano nos meten en el bolsillo. Y cuando nosotros narramos esta técnica de ellos, la mayoría de la gente lo ve, lo entiende, lo rechaza.
Súper gracias. Hay una pregunta de Diana. Bueno, Alejandro quiere hacer una pregunta, pero antes que hagas, Alejo, la pregunta de Diana Cariboni para Françoise y también para Heidi, ¿no? Que es el tema de la libertad religiosa, ¿no? Cómo la derecha, sobre todo en términos del ataque a las personas trans, ha hecho de la noción, y quizás Anat pueda responder también, ha hecho de la libertad religiosa como el derecho a la libertad religiosa como el mayor y más importante derecho de todos, ¿no? Uno de los más importantes. ¿Cómo ustedes lo ven eso en ese contexto de la elección? Y antes que venga Alejo, yo quería preguntar a Fernando, tenemos buenas proyecciones y ya sabemos cómo podrá ser un gobierno Trump, ¿ok? Porque hubo una experiencia anterior, hemos tenido Bolsonaro, tenemos Orbán, tenemos Milei, pero ¿qué va a pasar si no gana Trump? ¿No? Creo que también tenemos que pensar en ese escenario, ¿no? En la línea de lo que dice Anat, también tenemos que hacer un escenario distinto, ¿no? De la catástrofe completa. Alejo, contigo.
Sonia, pero yo creo que mi pregunta se relaciona, es precisamente eso, cómo prepararnos para el poselección, o sea, la elección es en noviembre, como bien decía Nat, muy probablemente esa conversación se va a extender hasta enero, pero cualquiera de los dos escenarios, gane Trump o gane Biden, pues hay que pensar el escenario post-electoral. Y ahí pues sería bueno recordar, de hecho esto es una referencia que hace Mónica Roa muchas veces, es eh, posterior al triunfo de Trump en la elección frente a Hillary Clinton, hubo una marcha de las mujeres y esa fue una respuesta muy importante como para levantar el ánimo del activismo, ¿no? Y entonces en esa medida, como qué perspectivas ven de respuesta de parte del activismo en ese escenario después de elecciones.
Super, gracias, Alejo. Como estamos sobre el tiempo, casi 9 horas, casi 2 horas acá, yo quería pedirles a Nat, Heidi, Françoise y Fernando que den respuestas súper rápidas para que podamos liberar las intérpretes.
So I can speak first since I'll speak in English and I need interpretation. On freedom of religion, that's been a strategy that's been used by the far right and the Republicans for quite a long time as the argument for basically freedom to discriminate. And so, for example, to refuse to serve LGBTQ folks and make them a wedding cake, or serve them in public establishments, and for pharmacists to refuse to sell contraceptives, and in general has been used to excuse and give a pretext for doctors to refuse to provide health care, such as abortion care. And that's been one of the strategies that we've seen not just since in Project 2025, but this has been used for quite a long time. And this is where I think what we were discussing, the use of freedom as a theme that the right wing has been able to weaponize and use to confuse people, because in fact, freedom to discriminate, of course, violates the rights of other people, and it's just, we need to just pull the strings and clarify the thinking, and remember that we have, in the case of government protections, especially separation of church and state in the US. But this, under Trump, the first Trump administration was used in particular with their Commission on Unalienable Rights, which Heidi mentioned, and that is referred to in Project 2025 as basically the Commission on Unalienable Right was a project to rewrite constitutional right in the US and to put freedom of religion as the preeminent right in the US Constitution, which would be turning everything up on its head. I mean, they really are bold. I mean, in that sense, they're really prepared to dismantle everything we've known. We've described their impact on the international system, Heidi described all they want to pull out of, but at the domestic level, they really want to completely transform what we've understood to be civil rights and constitutional rights. And on Project 2025, I'm curious to hear what Heidi has to say, but I think a lot of people are still unaware of what's in it. It's been used to mobilize the far right. They're very excited to see their plan, in writing. It's 900 pages, I believe. I mean, it is a tome, right? But honestly, the mainstream media has not done a very good job of explaining what's in it and putting the fear in ordinary citizens. So we're going to have to do this. We're doing it. But honestly, I think there should be a lot more concern in mainstream media about what's in there. It is terrifying, including for freedom of the press, of course.
I just add very quickly that I think you're right, Françoise. People don't know what's in there. We actually held a webinar a few weeks ago for journalists just to point out the restrictions on freedom of the press and things like NPR and Voice of America. They did not know about it. And just one thing on religious freedom, there was a case in Tennessee in which a Jewish couple was denied the right to adopt a baby from a Christian adoption agency. And I find that if you're talking to somebody about religious freedom and you bring up that particular case, which highlights that this is also about discriminating against other religions and, of course, has anti-Semitic overtones, that it's a very good retort. And the group that represented the adoption agency was Alliance Defending Freedom, the nightmare for all civil rights protection. So just FYI.
Bueno, estamos ya a la hora. No sé si debo agregar a eso o solamente contestar la segunda pregunta de Alejandro sobre... Ok, la segunda. Sí. Bueno, sobre todo lo que estamos haciendo y también lo hicimos en el 2020 y fue... En el 2020 nosotros hicimos toda una campaña después de la campaña. Nosotros personalmente, entre el grupo que yo ayudo a manejar, hicimos $5 millones estadounidenses de investigaciones entre noviembre y enero para saber cómo persuadir a las personas para proteger el resultado. El mensaje que tal vez ustedes escucharon de Count Every Vote, cuenta cada voto, este mensaje lo utilizamos no solamente en anuncios, en rótulos, en eventos, pero nosotros movilizamos a grupos pequeños de votantes en cada lugar de votación donde la persona, y estamos hablando, nosotros no tenemos una elección, es uno de nuestros problemas principales. La elección aquí está administrado en cada lugar de una forma diferente. Estamos hablando de miles de elecciones a la vez. Entonces, en cada lugar, en los estados de batalla, nosotros movilizamos a grupos pequeños de personas, ir a sentar, a quedar ahí para ver la cuenta y para asegurar de que terminara la cuenta y de que el resultado fuera el resultado y ese resultado tiene que ir al nivel estatal. Entonces tenemos que volver a hacer eso y lo estamos haciendo ahorita. Estamos ahorita movilizando y reclutando. Tenemos que reclutar unos 10,000 nuevas personas para ser voluntarios en nuestras urnas, porque casi siempre esta población es gente de la tercera edad, jubilada, y ahorita están bajo amenaza tan fuerte que tenemos un problema fatal, que gente no quiere trabajar en las elecciones para simple y sencillamente tener lugares de votación. Entonces estamos en esto, que es un trabajo muy, muy, muy grande. Y estamos también siempre viendo cuáles son las amenazas contra las elecciones. Por ejemplo, en el 22 hubieron horribles amenazas en Arizona, que es un estado con una población latina muy grande, donde grupos de gente nacionalista llegaron con armas, pistolas grandes en los lugares de dejar papeletes en barrios muy latinos. Y el instinto natural, obviamente, de la gente es llamar la atención y decir, ahí está amenaza, ahí está amenaza, ahí está amenaza. Y lo que nosotros vemos es que al anunciar eso, crea miedo y la gente no quiere ir a votar. Y al no ir a votar, de allá estamos en peligro de perder. Entonces, en vez de hacer eso, lo que hicimos fue crear fiestas, poner, eh, poner puestas de taquerías, poner bandas de mariachi, hacer todo un trabajo voluntario para que gente blanca acompañara a gente latina a los lugares para poder votar tranquilamente. Entonces, hay que siempre quedar pensando en estas amenazas y cómo asegurar que no pasen las cosas, la violencia, pero a la vez no ayudar a la oposición en su misión, crear tanto miedo que hace a la gente dejar de querer actuar. En cuanto al Women's March y lo que tenemos que planear, mira, si no ven que tengo como maletas debajo de mis ojos por todo el trabajo que hay que hacer para ganar la elección y ganar la parte después de la elección, hay personas que están pensando en qué se va a consistir la resistencia, digamos. Y creo que la mayor lección que nosotros aprendimos, ojalá, fue que nombrarnos una resistencia para mí fue una equivocación, porque sencillamente cuando tú te nombras así, estás diciendo que yo me voy a quedar en la defensa de un status quo que todo el mundo sabe que no está bien. Y el hecho de que esto no está bien es la razón por qué muchas personas no quieren ir a votar. Entonces, nosotros tenemos que seguir, por difícil que sea, creando esa esperanza y este deseo y este deseo para un futuro diferente y este desafío. Lo que yo siempre digo, y tal vez termino así, es que si ustedes quieren que gente venga a tu fiesta, tienen a tu partido, que para nosotros es también la palabra para fiesta, hay que hacer mejor fiesta. Y nosotros, en vez de ser mejor fiesta, hacer better party, throw a better party, siempre estamos en defensa. Y esto es un problema.
Gracias, Anat. Me acordaste con tu último comentario, una Judith Butler respondiendo a una entrevista sobre su último libro. Le preguntamos en Brasil qué hacer para deshacer el fantasma del género, ¿no? Que es su concepto. Y ella nos ha dado una respuesta muy rápida que era, bueno, podemos hacer la crítica, desconstruir teóricamente, pero no hay cómo enfrentarlo si no tenemos capacidad de counter imagination, si no podemos contraimaginar el mundo, ¿no? Y creo que eso es un mensaje que quizás, un lindo mensaje para llevar de aquí hacia adelante, ¿no? Hacia las elecciones y todas las otras elecciones que vienen. Fernando, contigo.
Thank you. Quite quickly. Yes, well, what we can expect is, by one hand, the following, I would say, a continuation of one of the policies regarding infrastructure. I'm quite curious about how Biden will deal with China on a second term. I would bet that we'll have somehow to make a discussion regarding Ukraine. If we look to some of the discussions in the Democratic Party right now, I think there's a lot of talks already on how the US will have to engage with Russia. I think there are a lot of discussions regarding abortion rights and how the federal government somehow can maintain or create a broad structure to keep the rights going, and somehow this will have to be negotiated too. But to be a little bit too pessimistic again, Sonia, I would say that in Brazil, we are dealing with this right now. Even when the progressive side is able to win the election, the far right don't really goes away. So they're still able to keep the message on social media. They are still on the streets. They're able to keep control of the Congress, of some governors. So I would say second term of Biden, inshallah, will have one, will be quite weak, I would say, especially we have to deal with a more conservative Congress, with governors trying somehow to deal with him. And so we'll have that sort of high politics discussion happening, and also street level discussions somehow appealing. And again, we'll have to keep looking, even if Biden win in the end of the day.
Okay, muchas gracias. Thank you very much. This was a wonderful conversation. I thank everybody who was here. Agradezco a todos y todas que estaban. Tuvimos 30 personas hasta el final, después de 2 horas, lo que es, no, Nana, en nuestra experiencia bastante incomún, ¿no? En general terminamos con 10, 12, no tener 30 personas es un súper suceso. Les cuento que vamos a tener un buen informe de esa discusión. En ese caso, creo que los vamos a hacer en 3 lenguas, ¿no? En inglés, español y portugués. Y también muy en breve va a estar el vídeo disponible. Y es nuestro plan hacer, porque el vídeo largo, ¿no? 2 horas, vamos a hacer una edición, cortar el vídeo con sus mejores momentos para que pueda llegar a un público más amplio, porque creo que hemos tenido una conversación creativa, inteligente, concreta, sólida, realista, pero no sin counter imagination, no sin contra imaginación. Y creo que eso es quizás el mejor que llevamos, ¿eh? Y buenas noches.
Buenas noches, gracias. Y el video mañana.